How easy things could have been different. So there's a sense in which Marty's position is kind of arbitrary. What I do think is a sense that she has one of those qualities that lots of Hardy's characters have, is that they meet defeat rather more than halfway. I think it's an extraordinarily sad part of the story, and there are bits of it I can't read without weeping, and there are bits I would never try to quote in the lecture for fear of embarrassing myself and everybody else. But Marty actually looks at those gold sovereigns and they look back, and there's something ominous about the fact they become two of them, like a pair of eyes looking at her. But she can only bear their gaze until about dawn. And by the time it gets to dawn, she's given up. She's going to shore off her hair. But we notice that she's already learned from Barbara Perkham how to do it. She doesn't say, you don't need to tell me how to do it because I'm not going to do it. Even before she hears that Giles is meant for somebody else, Marty has mentally learned the right way to cut off her locks. So it's almost as if she knows that she's going to do it. So it's not quite a born loser, but there's that tendency to self-destruction or to meet defeat more than halfway, and I think there's that in the novel. Does that seem to you be a reasonable reply?
Yeah, one reading about the last paragraph, wouldn't you, when she's at Darwinian's grave? I find that very touching.
That's one of the bits that I won't try to read the whole paragraph, and I have tried to do it in lectures, and I end up turning around facing the blackboard and feeling extremely uncomfortable. My students pretend not to notice. They're very kind about these things. But yeah, that is, I think, there, because there's so many little details there. The fact that she's solitary doesn't just mean she's on her own today. It means that's her life. Yeah, that's it. There's nothing else there. And she kind of weds herself to a dead man. And there's the sense of a wasted life, the sense of what there might have been. Because as Karen was pointing out, she's clever. She's educated enough to write letters. She's got a good sense of what's going on around her. She's tough-minded. She's pragmatic and realistic, and she knows that Giles is in trouble when he loses his houses and so on. So she's got everything going for her in that sense, except that she's wedded to the memory of her love for a person who never spoke about love to her. And it's kind of achingly painful. I'm going to stop, otherwise I should start getting morbid.
Okay, thanks.
When I read through recently, I was kind of struck, I've noticed at the end how Giles is kind of relegated, and he kind of doesn't have his house anymore, and we know that he lives somewhere else. And then, all of the action at the end while he's dying is something it is that I've never been to before, and I was really picked a location. So I was just kind of, without having read that much around it, what is the significance of that location in general in
the location of the tragedy? Corinne?
I think, it's always struck me that there's a kind of weird similarity between Marty South and Martha in Wordsworth's poem The Thorn. And I don't know whether that makes any sense at all. There's this kind of sense that some characters seem to be very much outside and other characters more on the inside. And there's a kind of marginality that becomes very literal. And that hut is obviously not his original dwelling place where he lived. It's the sort of place, he has been relegated to it and he becomes more marginal. But then Grace goes there. So he's still more connected to the rest of the community in that way. And I really have no idea what I'm saying. I just thought, I ought to say something, but maybe somebody else has a better idea.
On the one hand, it's kind of nowhere. We haven't ever been there before. And it gives you the sense that these woods are much bigger than you thought they were, that there can be habitations that as it were, just got lost in the space of the woods. Yet when Grace calls the Fitzpiers and says, you've got to come to One Chimney Hut, it's by such and such a place, he says, yes, I know it. The Fitzpiers of all people can actually find his own way there. So it's both kind of remote and isolated, yet for plot reasons it can't be completely remote, because otherwise there's no chance that Fitzpiers, who's not even been in the area for months on end, there's no chance that Fitzpiers is going to be able to find it. That seems to be slightly puzzling. So it doesn't answer your question, but it adds another sort of aspect to why one might ask it, I think.
I just find it very odd that location and ambience and environment is so important. And then, to me, you know, a pivotal thing at the end is Giles's death. And there's quite a lot of action that just happens in those few chapters in the hut, around the hut, in the environment. And in all the time that Giles has been living there, we haven't visited yet. I just find it a slight shift in atmosphere, whereas the other locations in the novel you come back to, like the hill and the view from the top of the hill. Whereas, I don't know the answer, but I just find it curious.
Thank you. Linking with what Philip was saying earlier about, which I thought was very moving actually, about ordinariness and ordinary lives, and that is how people would die, just in a house, and there was nothing necessarily sensational about it. And it is that sense of the vulnerability of him, and he's just there and he's dying, and it just reminds us of this everydayness, this ordinary mortality, this ordinary frailty. So that could be maybe a way of seeing it.
This is kind of a question, just because I always find it really strange that Giles dies of exposure, because I feel that Giles is actually a very elemental character. He's described as being Autumn's very own brother. He's described as being, impersonating the elements of nature around him. So the fact that he then dies because he has been too much in nature seems a very strange thing. And of course, I don't know, potentially my answer, if I am using that, is that you need a house to die of exposure, because if he had been living in the woods, really being nature as he seems for the rest of the book, he couldn't die of exposure then, which would mean that the house was having to be added on as an afterthought. But I've never really understood why Hardy would kill off a character like that through exposure. It seems a kind of, a cruel irony, but then he likes that, doesn't he?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, Hardy often likes, coming back to your question, Hardy often likes to work with a very limited, closed location, doesn't he? In many of the novels, and perhaps in a novel like Laodicean, which is perhaps a lesser production with a lot of destabilised travelling, but again in Jude, I suppose, there is that disintegration of the folk community, and then there's a lot of moving about. Though in The Well-Beloved, his last novel, he again comes back to a very isolated location. So it's an interesting sort of question, I think.
It's just, does Giles really die of nature? Is it not more culture? Because if he hadn't obeyed social laws, chivalry, then his death would not have happened. So I think really it's a product of culture rather than nature.
Any takers? Culture, nature. I'll come to you. Could anyone on our panel of...
And a bit of typhoid fever as well.
A bit of typhoid fever.
Presumably what he would say about death.
Sorry, Corinne?
I just have a slightly more sense of the thought about your question, which I think is something to do with the idea of memory and the way people are kind of tied to their environments and houses. So you get sort of Grace, who still can see traces of herself when she goes back, and the memories are kind of rooted, and then people like Felice and Fitzpiers would struggle in the woodland community because they don't have those ties of association. And there's a really wonderful phrase in the novel, which I can't remember, but somebody else will. But I think when Giles loses his house that he's sort of grown up in and worked in, I guess he then loses those ties as well, and he goes into this hut, which isn't really his. It isn't his historically. It's just a functional space, and maybe that is also something weakening in that. So that's maybe a slightly more sensible approach, or something to think about at least, that those associations and that history are removed when he moves to that hut that isn't his, that is just a space, just a space to die in, essentially. Sorry.
It's perhaps as if Hardy's slightly playing there with Thoreau's hut, which is a very sustaining, in Walden, which is a very sustaining ambience. I don't know, and this, as you say, clearly isn't. But there was a question here.
Thank you. It was really leading on from what you were saying. I think maybe he dies because he's given up, he's lost Grace, he's lost his home with all those associations, his identity. Has he really got anything to live for? And his immune system goes down. gets a chest infection or whatever and gives up.
Okay.
I just wonder if Hardy uses it as a plot device in a similar way that he uses Michael Henchard's death in the hut in the woods. He's being, if I've got my plot right, in The Mayor of Casterbridge, he's obviously fallen out of favour and things have gone very wrong for him, and he's living in a remote hut being tended to by, I can't remember who, a servant, yeah, Habe. And I think that there's a sort of sense of tragedy and pathos that is increased by removing the protagonist or one of the central characters from the sort of cultured society and placing them in the rural landscape and just kind of increasing the sense of tragedy of that environment and that character.
It's a subject to which Hardy returned in his non-fictional writings, the decline of the leasehold copyhold arrangements, which his own parents partook of. And he spoke of traditional ways of life, traditional customs and forms and so on. They faded away because people are losing the connection between themselves and their surroundings because of the new system whereby they had to migrate from fair to fair looking for work rather than have the three generations succeeding one another in a house.
Of course, we see that with Sir John Durbeyfield dramatically, don't we? Yeah.
Philip, you said you didn't think that this was a tragic novel. But I wonder whether you only think that because there's no tragic hero. That was what you seemed to imply. And I wonder whether there isn't in Hardy, in a number of his novels, a different, perhaps more general conception of tragedy, which isn't so Aeschylean, if you like, isn't so Aristotelian, and certainly not so Shakespearean. That it's not just that an individual has a particular defect which causes their downfall, but rather that they're in the grip of kind of forces which are somehow sort of ranged against them and which, sort of bring them to destruction, or maybe not complete destruction, but sort of to a state of affairs which is not very satisfactory at the end of it. So I think there is tragedy in this novel, but perhaps not of a traditional style.
No, I would entirely go along with that. I was thinking in context about the notion of the tragic heroes and tragic heroines. There's a sense in which one can think about tragedy as having, in terms of the state of the protagonist, having done this. Aeschylus and Sophocles have their heroes battling the gods. By the time you get to Shakespeare's time, they're battling fate or something like that, but at least they're kings and queens and princes. By the time you get to the 19th century, they're tending to be middle-class, articulate people who at least can say something about their condition. And by the time you get in the 20th century, you're heading down towards train spotting, as it were. You're down to those people who are going right down below. And one of the things that happens in the 19th century is the attempt to provide a sense of tragedy for people who are inarticulate. And the great example in Hardy is Fanny Robin in Far From the Madding Crowd, where Hardy actually speculates at one moment that the quality of suffering might depend a bit upon the quality of intelligence and articulacy, because he suggests that Bathsheba might, in an absolute sense, suffer more than Fanny. Fanny suffers enough to die. Bathsheba suffers enough to go and spend a night lying by a swamp. But in an absolute sense, she might suffer more because it's in her nature to be capable of that much more suffering. So there's a lot of speculation about what suffering might be like, and that's clearly a very dangerous argument. I'm sure Hardy knows it's a dangerous argument, partly because by the time he was writing the novel, it was still widely being argued that, for example, black people in America couldn't ever suffer as much as white people, and they didn't suffer pain in the same degree. Rosa Dartle in Dickens' David Copperfield says, isn't it good to know that when the poor are hurt, they don't actually feel it? She may or may not be being ironic, but it's very hard to tell with that character. So there is, I think, that sense that, but once you take the notion that, as it were, that sort of suffering is now the ordinary lot of ordinary human beings, the word tragedy doesn't seem to me to apply in quite the same way, because tragedy at some level seems to suggest something exceptional. It's not, if to say life is tragic, well, okay, now we've said that, there's not much more else to say. But is that life more tragic than this other one? And I think it's difficult to think of Beckett as being a tragic writer, for example. When you say, I can't go on, I will go on, you've reached a kind of tragic vision, and I can see that. But it's hard to think that the texts formally feel like tragedies. It's a difficult question to answer, but I entirely take your view that once you strip away the idea of tragic heroes and heroines, it's perfectly reasonable to think this is a tragic novel, and Marty is the person in it who seems to epitomise what it feels like to be a hurt, wounded human being. Sorry, I think Tracy was doing one.
Yeah, sure. I just add to that, of course, there was a famous debate quite a few years ago now between George Steiner, who published a book called The Death of Tragedy, arguing that because of the loss of religious beliefs and secure social system, tragedy, the death of the great man, as it were, could no longer existed. Raymond Williams replied to that with a very brilliant book, Modern Tragedy, where he argued that, more or less what Philip's arguing perhaps, that tragedy today is a social tragedy. And he takes Ibsen rather than Hardy perhaps as his key example, but it did open up a big debate about the nature of tragedy, which I think Hardy's work, from Williams's point of view, and those of us who would perhaps follow Raymond, was very illuminating, I think, and took a different tack from the argument of George Steiner.
So I'm just wondering about the 1857 Divorce Act, which was obviously one of the themes of one of the subjects picked up by the novel. Just wondering if anyone knows what the effect was on any other than the middle and upper classes of that act, and the fact that really, I mean, it was illusionary in terms of the way it was used in the novel. But just if there's anyone knows any background to the effect it had on divorce and situations such as appear in the novel.
Okay, what date was that? 1857 Divorce Act. Any experts on divorce on our panel? Philip, you're
Yes,
I couldn't possibly comment.
Yeah, my life story reads widowed, divorced and dumped. So I got a complete set. The 1857 Divorce Act had essentially, before 1857, you could only get divorced. You did three things. First of all, you sued a man for what was called criminal conversation. That is, he had in some way trespassed on your marital property and you got damages. Second stage was to get a divorce mensa et thoro, from bed and board, and that was established through the ecclesiastical courts. Once you'd done that, you could get a private act of parliament which annulled your marriage and gave you the right of remarriage. Hugely expensive. It was a way for very, very rich men to get rid of their wives. Only 4 women since the Restoration had actually succeeded in a divorce. The 1857 put all those procedures in one court, and it became a way for middle-class men to get rid of their wives as well. A man could divorce his wife on the grounds of her adultery plus other sorts of things as well. But a woman could only divorce her husband if, in addition to adultery, he had deserted her for 2 years or had used the sort of level of violence which would actually have got him jailed anyway, or incest. So essentially, so long as you were prepared to visit your wife from time to time, didn't beat her unconscious and didn't sleep with your sister, essentially the woman could never divorce the husband. And Fitzpiers clearly hasn't done any of those things. Grace's only hope would be that he would stay away for longer than 6 months. But once he comes back and says, I want to live with you again, you start counting all over again. It's got to be 2 years from then. And once he has said, I would like to have you back, and she has said no, then she never gets the chance of divorce. So it was essentially an act allowing moderately wealthy men to get rid of their wives. And so it remained until 1949, or 1923, when the law changed and the grounds of divorce became equal for men and women. So that, pretty late on. And it wasn't until 1949 that legal aid was available for divorce, which meant now that people who weren't well-to-do could get divorced as well. Does that cover? Yeah, there were two arguments in favour of the legislations that came out. One was, as the Lord Chancellor put it, in very, very vulgar terms indeed, a woman's divorce might be a woman's adultery might be the means of palming spurious offspring on her husband. She could smuggle cuckoos into the nest, and it would foul up the line of inheritance. Whereas a man's adultery didn't have that consequence. So that was the legal argument for saying that men's adultery shouldn't be the grounds of divorce. The other argument was constantly expressed in Parliament. It was that a woman's adultery caused men a terrible amount of pain, whereas a sensible woman took no notice of her husband's adultery. And that was fairly grotesque. But nonetheless, it was argued. Gladstone, God bless him, decided that divorce was a bad thing, but if you were going to have it, there could be no difference in law where there was no difference in the sight of God. So the divorce laws ought to be the same for men and women. So one brownie point for Gladstone.
Well, thanks very much. Could I just thank our panel, not only for the answers now, but for the papers and the talks they've given during the day, which have been really very rewarding. So thanks very much, everyone.